Good morning, everybody. And while Iranian diplomats were sitting across a table in Doha yesterday, supposedly negotiating the details of a ceasefire that's been holding, barely, since early April, the IRGC Navy was quietly sending fast attack boats and hovercraft out into the Strait of Hormuz under cover of darkness to lay live sea mines, and CENTCOM did not let that ride. So today we're breaking down exactly what got hit, why hovercraft and mine warfare are such a specific and dangerous combination in that stretch of water, what Iran is claiming happened in return, and why this single overnight exchange might tell you more about the actual state of this ceasefire than any of the statements coming out of Doha. Then stick around for the global roundup, because there's more happening around this than just one strike. Let's get into it. First, the backdrop, because you need to understand how fragile this ceasefire already was before last night. Back on April 8th, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week pause in the fighting, brokered by Pakistan, after Islamabad's earlier attempt at a longer, phased framework got rejected by Tehran in favor of its own 10-point counterproposal. That initial truce was shaky from the opening hours, with Gulf states reporting drone activity almost immediately after it was announced. President Trump extended it indefinitely on April 21st, anyway, betting that keeping the guns quiet while negotiators worked the details was worth absorbing some inevitable friction along the way. And there has been plenty of friction. This ceasefire has been violated by both sides more times than anyone's bothered to count cleanly, with strikes flaring up and dying back down every few weeks depending on who felt provoked most recently. So when I tell you that Iran tried to lay mines in the Strait of Hormuz last night while its own diplomats were mid-negotiation in Doha, that's not really a shocking break from the pattern. It's the pattern, just with a specific and genuinely dangerous weapon attached to it this time. And it's worth remembering just how far this war has already come to get to this point, because the ceasefire itself sits on top of months of escalation. This whole thing kicked off back in late February when Israel and the United States launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. That campaign ran hot for weeks, hitting everything from radar sites to missile production facilities to naval assets before the two sides finally agreed to sit down. Even the sanctions groundwork was laid ahead of that, with the IRGC Treasury designating more than 30 individuals, entities, and vessels tied to Iran's oil shipping network back in late February, specifically to choke off the revenue Iran needed to keep funding this fight. So by the time Pakistan brokered that April 8th pause, both sides were already exhausted from a genuinely brutal opening phase of the war, and the ceasefire that followed was always more of a controlled simmer than an actual off-switch. Trump's decision to extend it indefinitely on April 21st was a bet that a longer runway for negotiators was worth tolerating exactly the kind of incidents we're talking about today. Here's what CENTCOM says actually happened. Monday, U.S. forces conducted what they're calling self-defense strikes in southern Iran, and CENTCOM spokesman Captain Timothy Hawkins put out a statement saying, American forces conducted these strikes to protect U.S. troops from threats posed by Iranian forces. The targets were 2 IRGC boats caught in the act of laying mines in the strait, plus a surface-to-air missile site near Bandar Abbas that reporting says was actively targeting American aircraft in the area. Reporting out of the region also describes the boats involved as Peykaap class fast attack craft along with hovercraft, operating specifically under cover of darkness, which is a detail that matters a lot more than it might sound like on the surface, and I'll get into exactly why in a minute. Bandar Abbas itself is the key piece of geography here. It sits right at the narrowest useful point of the strait, and functions as the primary operational hub for both Iran's conventional navy and the IRGC Navy. So when you hear mine-laying operations and a SAM site both tied to that same stretch of coastline, that's not a coincidence. That's Iran's most sensitive naval real estate in the entire country. Think about what that location actually means operationally for a second. Everything Iran needs to run a maritime denial campaign against the strait flows through or near Bandar Abbas. The small boat pens, the mine storage depots, the coastal radar picket line, and the air defense umbrella meant to protect all of it from exactly the kind of American aircraft that have been running patrols over the area throughout this war. When CENTCOM says it hit a SAM site there that was actively targeting American aircraft, that's not a random target of opportunity. That's the specific piece of the puzzle that would have let Iran keep laying mines undisturbed on future nights, by keeping USS surveillance and strike aircraft at arm's length. Take that SAM site out alongside the 2 boats actually caught in the act, and you're not just stopping one night's mining attempt, you're degrading Iran's ability to protect the next attempt too, which is exactly the kind of layered thinking you'd expect from a strike package built by planners who've been watching this exact playbook since March. And Iran's own state media has already put its version of the exchange on the record. Fars news agency, which functions as an IRGC-aligned outlet, claimed that an American MQ-9 Reaper drone was shot down during the exchange, and that Iranian air defenses also fired on a second MQ-9 and an F-35 Lightning II. None of that has been independently confirmed on the American side as of this morning. And I want to be upfront about that instead of just repeating it as fact, because Iranian state media has a long track record in this war of claiming intercepts and kills that later don't hold up once actual wreckage or radar data gets compared. And it's worth walking through why that skepticism is warranted instead of just asserting it. Over the course of this war, Iranian outlets have claimed multiple shootdowns of American and Allied aircraft that were later quietly walked back or never independently verified by open-source trackers, satellite imagery, or on-the-record Pentagon statements. That doesn't mean every claim FARS News puts out is automatically false. Sometimes these claims do turn out to be accurate. But it does mean the responsible way to treat a same-day claim like this one is to hold it as unconfirmed until something more solid shows up, whether that's wreckage photos, a Pentagon acknowledgement, or independent satellite tracking of the airspace that night. If CENTCOM does lose an MQ-9 or comes close to losing an F-35 in an engagement like this, that's a serious escalation on its own and deserves real scrutiny, but scrutiny means waiting for confirmation, not repeating an IRGC-aligned outlet's claim as though it's already settled fact. What is confirmed straight from CENTCOM itself is the IRGC statement that followed, which said the group warns against any violation of the ceasefire by, in their words, the invading American army, and that it considers its right to a reciprocal response, both legitimate and certain. So Iran is threatening retaliation for strikes that were themselves a response to Iran laying mines in the middle of a ceasefire. That's the loop we're in. And let's actually talk tactics here, because the hovercraft piece of this story is the part that deserves more attention than it usually gets. A hovercraft riding on an air cushion doesn't need deep water and doesn't leave the same kind of wake signature a traditional hull does, which means it can operate in the skinny, silty, reed-choked shallows along Iran's own coastline where a normal patrol boat, let alone a warship, simply can't follow. That's exactly the kind of terrain Iran has spent years building its coastal defense doctrine around, hiding fast, cheap platforms in places that are functionally invisible to conventional naval radar until they're already moving. Pair that with a Peykaap-class fast attack boat, which is a small, quick, Iranian-built platform that can carry torpedoes, or in this case, sea mines, and you've got a combination built for exactly one job: getting a handful of mines into a shipping lane at night, fast, and getting back to shallow water before anyone can react. And it's worth breaking down why Iran keeps reaching for this exact pairing instead of something bigger and more dramatic. A frigate, or a larger mine layer, is a huge trackable radar contact the moment it leaves port, and Iran knows full well that American and Allied surveillance assets have been watching its larger naval movements closely all war. A hovercraft, and a couple of small Peykaap boats, by contrast, barely register the same way. They're small, they're fast, they can loiter close to shore where the radar clutter from the coastline itself makes it hard to pick them out from ordinary fishing or patrol traffic, and by the time they dash out to actually drop mines in the shipping lane, they're often back in the shallows before anyone's finished classifying the contact. That's the entire logic of asymmetric naval warfare in a nutshell. You don't need to win a fight with a bigger navy. You just need to be small and cheap and deniable enough that the other side's overwhelming advantage in firepower never actually gets a clean shot at you until it's already too late to stop what you came to do. Sea mines themselves are one of the cheapest, oldest forms of naval area denial there is. You don't need a sophisticated navy to close a shipping lane with mines. You just need a few boats willing to slip out under darkness, and a lot of patience. Because once even a handful of mines are confirmed in a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, insurance underwriters and shipping companies react to that uncertainty almost as strongly as they'd react to an actual sinking. That's the entire point of the tactic. It's not really about physically stopping traffic. It's about making the risk of transiting that lane feel unacceptable to everyone who has to insure or captain a supertanker through it, which is exactly why even a two-boat attempt like last night's gets treated as a serious event instead of a minor skirmish. This is exactly the kind of asymmetric calculation I break down in the book, cheap tools used to create outsized strategic effects. And if that's the kind of thing you're into, the link's in the description, I'd really appreciate you checking it out. Now let's put this in context with what happened back in March, because this isn't the first time this exact scenario has played out. On March 10th, CENTCOM said American forces destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait after reports that Iran had begun laying mines there, and President Trump warned at the time that there would be, in his words, military consequences at a level never seen before if any mines that had already been laid weren't removed. CNN reporting from that period cited sources saying Iran had only laid a few dozen mines at that point, not extensively, but also noted Iran still retained more than 80% of its small boats and mine-laying craft even after that strike, meaning the capability to try this again was never actually eliminated, just temporarily degraded. Oil prices reacted hard to that news, spiking toward $120 a barrel before settling back down into the 80s as the immediate panic passed. The strait handles somewhere in the range of 13 to 20 million barrels of crude per day, depending on which tracking firm you ask. representing somewhere between a fifth and a third of all seaborne crude flows on the planet. So even a temporary partial mining attempt has ripple effects well beyond the Gulf itself. Last night's strike is really a smaller scale replay of that exact same March playbook, just with only 2 boats and a SAM site instead of 16 vessels, which either means Iran is testing the waters carefully this time to see how the US responds mid-ceasefire, or it means CENTCOM caught this attempt much earlier before it could scale up the way the March attempt did. It's also worth remembering what that March episode did to the shipping industry itself, because the effects didn't stop once the 16 vessels were destroyed. Major marine war risk insurers pulled coverage for vessels operating in the Persian Gulf entirely for a stretch, and supertanker charter costs in the Middle East climbed to record highs almost overnight. That's the part of this story that never shows up in a strike photo, the quiet, unglamorous reality that a handful of small boats laying a few dozen mines can do more damage to global shipping economics in a week than months of missile exchanges sometimes manage, simply because underwriters and ship owners don't wait around for confirmation before they start pricing in worst-case scenarios. So even though last night's episode was smaller in scale than March, the fact that it happened at all during active negotiations is exactly the kind of signal that puts that same insurance and shipping machinery right back on edge. If you're enjoying this kind of pattern matching across the different phases of this war, that's a big part of what the book is built around, tracking how the same tactics get recycled and adjusted as both sides learn from the last round. Links below. I'd really appreciate the support. Now back to it. Let's talk about the diplomatic side of this for a second, because the contrast between what was happening in the room in Doha and what was happening in the water off Bandar Abbas at the exact same time is the real story here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said publicly this week that talks on a fuller agreement with Iran are being held up by disagreements over, in his words, a word, a sentence, which tells you the two sides were reportedly close enough to be haggling over specific phrasing rather than big structural issues. And yet, in that same window, Iran's own foreign ministry put out a statement accusing the United States of repeatedly violating the ceasefire, describing what it called numerous maritime robberies against Iranian commercial ships, and specifically accusing Washington of flagrantly violating the ceasefire in Iran's Hormuz region, which again is exactly where Bandar Abbas and the Strait itself sit, over what it described as the preceding 28 hours. So depending on which government's statement you read, this entire sequence is either a legitimate American self-defense response to an active Iranian ceasefire violation, or it's the latest in a string of American provocations against Iranian shipping. Both of those framings got put out publicly within about a day of each other, and CNN's own reporting on the American side captured that gap directly, describing the U.S. as continuing to insist the ceasefire is, in their word, ongoing, even while casting Iran as the aggressor in the exact same breath. That gap between the two official narratives is honestly the most useful window we get into how fragile this whole arrangement actually is. Neither side has any real incentive to be the one that publicly declares the ceasefire dead, because whichever government does, that first takes the blame for restarting a war that's already cost both countries enormously. So instead, you get this strange parallel track dynamic, where American officials keep repeating that the ceasefire holds even as they authorize strikes, and Iranian officials keep accusing Washington of violations even as their own navy is the one that got caught laying mines in the middle of an active negotiation. Both governments have a reason to keep using the word ceasefire in public no matter what's actually happening in the water off Bandar Abbas, and that's exactly the kind of gap between rhetoric and reality that's worth watching closely instead of taking either side's press statement completely at face value. You made it to the global roundup, my friends, so let's cover what else is sitting around this story. Iran's Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who stepped into that role following his predecessor's death earlier this year, made public remarks this week suggesting that regional nations would no longer serve the same role for outside powers that they have in the past, language that regional analysts have read as another signal aimed at Gulf states hosting American forces rather than at Washington directly. That kind of framing is worth watching closely going forward, because a new supreme leader, still establishing his own voice on the international stage, has every incentive to sound tougher than his predecessor early on, if only to shore up support among the hardline factions inside Iran's own system who are watching every public statement for signs of weakness. Gulf oil markets remain jumpy, with global crude prices ticking back up on the news of renewed strikes near the Strait, curbing some of the optimism that had been building around a broader deal actually getting finalized in Doha. Energy traders have spent this entire war treating the Strait almost like its own separate instrument to price, reacting within hours to even small skirmishes near Bandar Abbas the way they'd react to a major OPEC announcement, which tells you how central this single waterway has become to how the whole market is thinking about risk right now. And on the American side of the ledger, defense officials have continued to note that Hess assets tied to Operation Epic Fury remain forward postured in the region and available for exactly this kind of rapid retasking, which is likely part of how last night's response came together so quickly once those mine-laying boats were spotted. That forward posture isn't cheap to maintain, and it's part of the reason both sides have an incentive to eventually land somewhere at the negotiating table, because an indefinite ceasefire punctuated by strikes like this one is expensive and risky for everyone involved, not just the country getting hit. There's also the broader regional picture to keep an eye on here, because the Strait isn't the only pressure point in this conflict. Reporting throughout this war has shown Iran testing similar tactics, missile launches, drone harassment, and naval provocations against multiple points along its coastline and against Gulf neighbors who host American forces, not just directly against U.S. assets. Every one of those individual incidents gets treated as its own standalone story in daily coverage. But stacked together, they paint a picture of a regime that's using a wide menu of low-cost, deniable options to keep pressure on Washington and its regional partners simultaneously, testing which pressure points draw the strongest response and which ones get absorbed quietly. Last night's mine-laying attempt fits neatly into that same broader pattern, just aimed specifically at the one choke point that matters most to the global economy. You made it to the 40,000-foot strategic analysis section, and here's the framework I'd leave you with today. A ceasefire that's being violated by both sides every few weeks isn't really a ceasefire in the traditional sense. It's a cap on the intensity of an ongoing war rather than an end to it. And last night is a pretty clean illustration of exactly why that distinction matters. Iran's leadership can sit across a table in Doha negotiating the wording of a permanent deal, while its own naval forces are simultaneously testing whether the ceasefire's boundaries have loosened enough to try mining the strait again, because those two tracks, the diplomatic one and the military one, don't have to move in lockstep inside the Iranian system the way they might somewhere with a single unified chain of command making every call. That's not necessarily a sign of deliberate bad faith at the very top. It could just as easily be a sign of exactly the kind of internal friction between IRGC commanders and the diplomatic corps that's been visible at other points in this war. But from Washington's side, the result looks the same either way. A mine-laying attempt during active talks, and the response looks the same either way too. A fast, proportionate strike that removes the immediate threat without blowing up the broader negotiation. That proportionality piece matters more than it might seem. CENTCOM had options last night beyond just the two boats and the SAM site. It could have treated this as a full ceasefire collapse and gone after a much wider target, set the way it did back in February and March. It didn't. It hit exactly what needed to be hit to stop the immediate threat, and left the door open for Rubio and his counterparts to keep arguing over that word and that sentence in Doha today. That's a deliberate choice, not an accident. And it tells you the administration still sees more value in protecting the negotiation than in using this incident as an excuse to escalate further. The question worth watching going forward isn't whether Iran will try this again, because the March precedent and last night both suggest they will. Keeping roughly 80% of the mine-laying capability intact means the tool is still sitting in the toolbox. The real question is whether CENTCOM keeps catching these attempts early and small, the way it apparently did last night with two boats, or whether a future attempt slips through at a bigger scale the way the March attempt briefly did before those 16 vessels got hit. That gap between an early two-boat intercept and a 16-vessel scramble after mines are already in the water is exactly the margin this ceasefire is actually being fought over right now, no matter what specific word or sentence Rubio and his counterparts are still arguing about in Doha. Let's actually walk through the command structure question for a second, too, because I think it explains a lot about why incidents like this keep happening, even when the top of the Iranian government is negotiating in good faith. Iran doesn't have one single navy, it has two, running in parallel. There's the conventional Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, which operates more like a traditional national naval force and answers up through the regular military chain of command. And then there's the IRGC Navy, which is a separate organization entirely, ideologically driven, historically more aggressive, and directly tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, rather than the country's conventional defense ministry. It's the IRGC Navy that's been behind almost every fast boat harassment incident, mine-laying attempt, and small boat swarm tactic throughout this entire war, not the conventional Navy. That split matters enormously for understanding nights like last night, because it means Iran's civilian negotiators in Doha aren't necessarily lying when they express frustration at renewed strikes. They may genuinely be negotiating in good faith, while a separate, ideologically distinct arm of their own military apparatus runs its own parallel escalation track, with a level of independence that would be unthinkable in most Western militaries. Whether that's a bug in Iran's command structure or a deliberate feature that gives the regime built-in deniability, it produces the exact same practical effect either way. A ceasefire that gets tested from within Iran's own system almost as often as it gets tested from outside it. That dynamic is also exactly why CENTCOM's target selection last night is worth paying close attention to. Hitting the 2 mine-laying boats and the SAM site specifically, rather than a broader set of conventional Iranian Navy assets, keeps this firmly contained to the IRGC's lane, rather than treating it as an attack on Iran's military as a whole. That's a distinction with real diplomatic value, because it lets Tehran's civilian negotiators keep sitting at the table without having to publicly answer for a strike against their entire national navy, while still sending an unmistakable message to the specific IRGC units that keep trying this tactic that the tactic itself doesn't work. Every single time an incident like this gets resolved with a small, proportionate response, instead of a full reignition of the war, that's actually the system working the way it's designed to work, even though it doesn't feel that way watching explosion footage at Bandar Abbas. The alternative to this messy, start-stop, mine boats versus precision strikes equilibrium isn't a clean peace. It's very likely a much bigger war restarting from scratch, with all the cost in lives and money that the first phase of this conflict already extracted from everyone involved. So as frustrating as it is to watch the same cycle repeat, mines get laid, boats get hit, statements get issued, talks continue anyway, that repetition is itself a kind of fragile success. It just happens to be the kind of success that requires CENTCOM to keep getting the timing right every single time. Because the one night they don't catch the mine-laying attempt early is the night this whole calculation changes. And that's really the trade-off sitting underneath every single one of these overnight incidents, whether it's 2 boats in a SAM site or 16 vessels at once. Nobody in Washington or Tehran gets to declare victory off a night like last night. CENTCOM doesn't get to say it ended Iran's mine warfare capability, because 80% of that fleet is still sitting in port somewhere along that coastline. And Iran doesn't get to claim it successfully disrupted the strait, because the mines never made it into the water long enough to actually threaten a single tanker. What both sides get instead is more time, a few more weeks for Rubio's team and their Iranian counterparts to keep working through the wording in Doha, a few more weeks for the oil markets to settle back down from the spike, and a few more weeks for whichever side is still weighing whether this ceasefire is worth keeping to decide that it still is. That's a much less satisfying ending than a decisive military victory for either side, but it's honestly the most accurate way to describe where this war actually sits today. What do you think? Do you think this ceasefire holds through the rest of the negotiation? Or do you think we're looking at another full breakdown building the same way it did back in the spring? Let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear your read on it. If you want the deeper framework behind how I think about this kind of layered start-stop conflict, the book's linked below, and I'd really appreciate you checking it out. Follow along on X and Instagram. I'm posting extra breakdowns there most days that don't make it into these videos, and I'll see you in the next one.